Today on the Snack Covenant.
Because they say, like, no one goes down here, you end up with the situation where, because no one's supposed to go down there, all the people you don't want end up down there as well.
Yeah.
So you have to start putting things in charge there, but they're not allowed to be, like, normal. They have to be, like, ghosts, or they have to be, like, stone, or something like that, or metal.
Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Sin.
Hi, everyone. And welcome to the welcome to What, Where, Why of Elden Ring, Episode 6. And today we're going to talk about the Guardian of the Old Lords.
You don't fucking know what you're talking about at all.
I forgot what its name was, but I'm pretty sure Guardian was in it.
It wasn't.
Watchdog of the Old Lords.
That's your pop on.
Guardians of the Galaxy 4.
Correct.
Now, Sophie.
Yes, Sin.
For anyone who's new to the podcast, What, Where, Why is a series...
Just after that. What do we do with Guardians of the Galaxy 4? To anyone who's new. Anyone who heard that is like, I have to keep going.
In this series, we answer 3 simple questions. What? Where? And why?
Failed what?
But we don't do it alone. We do it... we do it with the help of our good friend Angelic Outline, who's currently on vacation. So this one we'll actually have to do alone. Now, Sophie.
Yes, Sin.
What is the name of the entity we're talking about today?
The Erdtree Burial Watchdog.
Erdtree Burial Watchdog? Looking at its name, we can already decipher at least 3 things in the what section.
Go on, Sin, go on.
First, its name tells us that on planet Elden Ring, there are people who may steal from graves or try to vandalize them.
Yes.
Second, it tells us that there's a tradition of Erdtree burials happening in Elden Ring. And third, this is a mechanical creature, therefore created by Salivus, who charged way too much for them, and that's how he was able to afford his hat. Thank you.
Solved it.
Now, Sophie, what's your take on this non-Bloodborne character?
Okay, so there's kind of, depending on how you look at it, either 2 or 4 different kinds of watchdog. Because the Burial Watchdog comes in 2 different forms. One has 1 head and one has 3 heads. And it also has 2 different sets of weapons. So it will either have a very big sword, which actually mentions what you were saying, that people are robbing the tombs. So it'll say this sword used to have this, like, I think it's called the Grave Robber's Eye embedded in the hilt of it. And that's since been stolen. Yep. And the other version has a, it's just called a staff, but sometimes they call it a crozier, which is a little staff, and it uses it to, like, throw little, like, magic attacks at you. Yes, Sin, I think you have a question.
You just made me think of something. You know how there was something in the sword, and it was stolen, and it's, like, very, like, inappropriate to steal things that are there that may be decorations that aren't your own. So this reminds me of when we just moved to Canada from the Union. And one thing that completely shocked me and my parents is that, like, you walk in a neighborhood, right? And people have pots with plants outside, and they're not chained down. It's just pots outside, and people put them outside with confidence that they're not going to get stolen. That was shocking to me.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So in the Union, did you or did you not have enormous stone dogs that you placed outside to guard those pots?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And even those got the ice stolen.
Oh,
Continue.
that was the end of the question.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Sophie.
okay, technically there's also another kind
Yeah.
that are just called the lesser watchdogs.
Why
that
is it
are
lesser?
because they
You
don't
know
have
why it's
boss.
lesser? You know why it's lesser?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Sin here. I just told a story that was not good enough to include in the rest of the podcast. But if you would like to hear the unedited episode, you can go to patreon.com/SinclairLore. We also have other episodes of What Where Why that are Patreon exclusives. For example, What Where Why of Elden Ring, What Where Why of Bloodborne, and What Where Why of the Dan Brown Memorial Shisha Lounge. Thanks, and back to the podcast. When was it built?
That is a really good question. So this is kind of the question that, like, I went down quite a rabbit hole when you said we were going to do this.
Okay.
Because basically, I asked people, like my friends, like, hey, what like creature would you want us to cover? And a bunch of them said Watchdog, so we decided to do Watchdog. But the Watchdog itself is actually kind of complicated, like where it all fits into everything.
How so?
The Watchdogs are in these tomb areas, right?
Yeah.
And something that we've talked about when we talk about Leyndell is that Leyndell sort of doesn't have like a progression of architectural styles through it. Leyndell almost looks like it was like designed and 3D printed in the sky and they just dropped it.
Mm-hmm.
So Leyndell sort of arrives fully formed. So the distinction between Leyndell and like the sewers and catacombs under Leyndell is very stark. Like they don't look like they're the same at all. They don't look like there's been a progression of styles down from the bottom up to the top. So like if you look below, like obviously there's the Watchdogs, there's also these like these weird imp statues. The Watchdog statues decorate everywhere. It's quite sort of roughly carved out of the ground. Like it's like these big like tunnels and shafts and things. And then there's almost like a completely clean break and then other cities above it. Mm-hmm. So the impression that you get is that like what was below in those catacombs and tombs and everything, that was like built separately and a very long time ago. And everything was built over the top of that. And there's all these characters and motifs and symbols and things that are just associated with the catacombs. And they're not associated with anywhere else.
Okay.
The concept of like Erdtree burial and like needing to guard the dead and everything, that seems to come way before like most of the rest of the places in the game. Like they almost start with the catacombs and build on top of that.
That sounds a lot like Bloodborne.
So the impression that you get from the catacombs is that like these catacombs were built separately and by like a almost like a not a distinct culture, because it was, I think we can pretty confidently say it was like the Golden Order that built these things. But everything about them is very distinct and very separate from everything else. Mm-hmm. And I think that is like the interesting kind of aspect to them, which ties into something that we've talked about before, which is the way that Marika relates to death and dying.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the underground areas like Ansel and Shifra, there's no like catacombs there, and they have the dead on display. Like if you go down, like that's the thing you'll probably first notice when you explore Shifra. They're venerating the dead. They're venerating these big, like they look like elk things that have died, but they venerate them by having the body in public.
Yeah.
And they stand around it. So it's like this thing is dead, but we are acknowledging that it is dead, and we're almost celebrating the fact that it's died. And all around that area you see like the ancestor people, like they appear, but they appear in this almost like ghostly form a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And you also see like the way that they dress, like they wear like horns and they carry like bones and things, almost like they're happy like being one with the dead.
They're embracing it, essentially.
They're embracing it. And like again, like the other big thing everyone notices about the underground cities is that they have those massive, they're called the chair crypts. There's these massive chairs with just a skeleton in it.
Yeah, again, death is very much on display.
Yeah, they are. They're like at home with the idea of dying. Like they're at peace with it.
And then what about the mausoleums?
The mausoleums, like, they're still something that needs to be properly unpacked because they're a little confusing. But
Okay.
the mausoleums also seem to be from there. Not
Okay.
the people in the mausoleums, but like the look of the mausoleums and where you find the mausoleums.
Mhm.
That seems to be like connected to the cities as well because it's like architecturally looks very similar. And you
Mhm.
find a bunch of them where Godwin is. Um, so what is interesting there is that like we're just going to assume Marika came from there. That's something that we've sort of like.
We talked about it
If we
before.
go into establishing it,
Yeah.
will be another 20 minutes. We'll just say, okay, Marika
Yeah.
came from here originally.
Yeah.
So Marika's whole deal is like she has issues with death. So when Marika founds her civilization, she does the opposite and she forces all the dead stuff underground. She's
Yeah.
like, if you're dead, we're gonna bury you, but we're gonna like specifically make these places that look nothing like anything else in the world. They have their own culture associated with them. There's you remember there's those statues of the weird like long necked snake guy who's got like a candle in his hand, and when you find him, the candle
Hmm.
points. Yeah, that character is called Rosus, the Usher of Death. You might initially think, oh, is he like an old like god of the lands between that sort of Marika supplanted? But there's references later to something called the Light of Rosus, and the Light of Rosus will sort of reveal things to you. And the Light of Rosus is a Golden Order Erdtree symbol.
Okay.
So Rosus is part of the Golden Order. We don't even know if he was a real person. He may just be symbolic. But all of
Mhm.
this stuff, like the catacombs, Rosus, the imps, the watchdogs, the weird like traps and everything, all of that is built by the Golden Order. Like they made all this up and they made it look completely different to everything else and they buried it.
Okay.
So it's the total opposite of what you saw in the Eternal Cities and in the rivers.
Right. Yeah.
And that's also why they have to make these watchdogs. Because if everyone who died in Elden Ring was just left on display, which they actually end up doing with like the people who are crucified and everything, but these like
Mhm.
great heroes and everything, because the graves tend to be of specific people, like the giant conquering hero or the hero of Azuria or something like that. When they bury them very, very deep down underground with no one else around them. So if they treated them like they do underground, and you say like ancient knight Kristoff died, and instead of burying him at the bottom of this tomb, we like left his like Lenin, like you left his body on display.
Yeah.
Um, you wouldn't need to worry about people stealing things from it because there'd be people all around, there'd be guards and everything. But because he
Yeah.
has been like put out of sight, buried very, very deep down, they have to worry about tomb robbers. They have to worry about like all these things that shouldn't be are starting to occupy this space that we sort of set this space aside. It's like, okay, dead stuff, it's like verboten, don't go there.
Mhm.
But because we did that, suddenly you got tomb robbers.
Yeah.
And who are again like they're the ones stealing the eyes from the watchdogs. They're these tomb robbers. So we have to install like these non-living guardians to look after the place. Which
Yeah.
is it's the burial tree watchdogs. It's also the imps, and it's also there's these duelists. You sometimes see they dress like a gladiator. You sometimes see them underground as well. And it specifies like what their story is that like they were humans and they were driven out of the place they used to be, and they were forced to become the guardians of the tombs. So you can't just have like rotating like Lane guards in the tombs and everything because you're not supposed to acknowledge that there's all this death around you. So because they say like no one goes down here, you end up with the situation where because no one's supposed to go down there, all the people you don't want end up down there as well. So you have to
Yeah.
start putting things in charge there, but they're not allowed to be like normal. They have to be like ghosts, or they have to be like stone or something like that, or metal.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, interestingly enough, by saying what you did, you actually answered a lot of other questions that
Mm-hmm.
we have. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
The other thing I would mention is that the watchdogs, the way that like some of them have three heads, and you see the three-headed design like along the sides of the tombs a lot. I think that is supposed to evoke Cerberus, the idea that there's like a three-headed watchdog that is guarding the
Right.
underworld. Yeah, I think that's where that little motif comes from.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sin.
Let me ask you.
Yeah.
How do you think those guardians function?
Okay, so this, I think, goes back to, those massive golems you see wandering around? The golems are interesting in this regard, because I remember when the game first came out, people were like, what side are the golems on? Because you see them everywhere. Like, you don't just see, like, they're not just in Stormvale, they're not just in Caelid, they're not just in Leyndell, they're all over the place. Mm-hmm. And the answer is, like, they're actually on everyone's side. Because you have to remember that there was a point in time, like, at the very beginning, where Marika's children were not feuding. What happens is that when they start feuding, they basically just get their golems. And whatever golems they happen to have, like, they're fighting everyone else. They're just like a tool. So those golems there's one reference, but it's significant to, there were people who were just the old Golem Crafters. Mm-hmm. So a long time ago, there were people and they just made golems, and presumably they just made a ton of golems, put them all around the lands between. All of Marika's children took them, and then when the shattering happened, everyone's respective golems just got brought into battle with each other. The item that mentions the Golem Crafters is a thing called the Crystal Dart. And what a Crystal Dart does is when it pierces a quote-unquote golem, it makes the golem kind of freak out. Like, it sort of makes it go out of control. So if you hit a golem with a crystal dart, it's sort of, it's like like that. It starts like thrashing around, and if there's other enemies around, it will damage the other enemies. That also works on the imps, and it also works on the watchdogs.
Okay.
So the watchdogs, presumably, they were crafted by, like, if not the same people, then the same methods that made the big golems. So, like, at the start of everything, Marika's like, okay, we've established our golden order, we've got our royal capital, we need guard dogs for the tombs, we need little imp things. The imp things, by the way, it says the watchdogs command the imps. So the imps sort of work for the watchdogs, like just making sure the tombs run properly. We need the big golems, and I guess we need, like, big chariot things for the tombs. And those were all made by presumably, like, the same, like, group of people. But they don't seem to be around anymore. You only hear about them in retrospect. And there's something about, like, the way that you make the crystal darts out of glintstone that suggests, like, there's something about the glintstone that when the glintstone pierces the golem, it, like, overloads it or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. Let me send you a picture. That's how I think the watchdogs work.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so do you want to elaborate a little more?
It's a man sitting inside an ATM distributing the money, because that's how an ATM works. It's not like cogs and electricity. It's somebody sitting in there and distributing the money and taking your check. Somebody's in the watchdog operating all the levers and all the switches and buttons.
Does the watchdog give money?
You know what? If they also repurpose the watchdog into an ATM, why would you repurpose a watchdog into the ATM, Sophie? Because you have a gift shop. Who has a coffee stand in Bloodborne?
Remember, it was the giant.
They need to contact the giant from the Yusefka's clinic, right? The underground.
Yeah. And Jennifer the Snatcher would come down. Coffee in the morning.
Jennifer the Snatcher would come down, open a little gift shop in the Burrial, make the watchdogs be the guardians as well as an ATM, and you have your business going, and you dissuade people from stealing things because there's always going to be tourists around there.
But see, I think this is what they should have done, because this whole situation has arisen because Marika will not accept death. But if she made death into a tourist attraction, everyone's around. No one's gonna. You don't have to build all these tombs and things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We should give her a call.
Like, I've got bad news.
Sophie, do the outro.
That was what was that?
What Were We of Elden Ring episode 6 or 7?
That was What Were We of Elden Ring episode 6.5. The Burial Tree Watchdog, also known as the Erdtree Burial Watchdog. In the this is actually the first boss I fought in Elden Ring. Because it was the boss in the network test, and there it was called Burial Tree Watchdog.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember them saying like Erdtree and Burial Tree, and I'm like, ooh, where is this going? Is it going to be two different trees? No. But, little bonus factoid.
Okay.
There is another tree that they mention once and never again called the Helfen. Because they talk about the dead as they go into the tombs, as they start to die. As people begin to die, they see this other tree called the Helfen, which is described as like a black tree with all these branches coming out the sides, and the dead are drawn to it in the same way that like the tarnished are drawn to the Erdtree. Like they see the light and they're drawn to it. And I am wondering if that is going to be the tree in Shadow of the Erdtree.
Oh.
Because the thing about, like, I was talking to Night of the Orchards about this last night, like the difference between when Dark Souls like drops a reference to something and when Elden Ring does it. Because in Dark Souls, like, they'll drop references to stuff that are never fully explained, they're not shown on screen, but it's like they're there to make a point, right? So, like, if you think about the Occult Rebellion in Dark Souls 1, remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you're like, oh yeah, that. Because it's never fully developed, but it's like, the idea of the Occult Rebellion is that, like, within the sort of, like, the depths of, like, Anor Londo, like, there's people plotting to overthrow the gods, right?
Yeah.
So that is there to make that point. It's there so you, like, they're hyping up Anor Londo all game, you go to Anor Londo, discover that it's mostly empty, discover that the gods have left, and then you discover that, oh yeah, also there were people plotting to overthrow them, right? So, discovering the people plotting to overthrow the gods is the point of the Occult Rebellion. The exact mechanics of the rebellion, who's involved in the rebellion, when it started, what the actual motives were, like, that's not important. What's important is just you knowing that fact. Hello, Enzo.
Hello.
Yeah, so it's there to make a point. Velka is kind of the same. Like, Velka's like, okay, Velka's there to point out, like, there is sin in the world, the gods have committed sins, there is this thing that is outside the jurisdiction of the gods that governs sin, so when you see, like, Velka stuff, it means that this is somewhere where the gods have trespassed. And that's all you need to know about Velka. That's all you need to know about the Occult Rebellion. Like, they're just there to make that point, right? In Elden Ring, when they drop references to something like the Helfen, or Rosus or something like that, it might be there to make a point. But for all we know, because of the way that this was written, it's possible that, like, in George R.R. Martin's notes, there's, like, pages and pages and pages of information about the Helfen and how it works.
Okay.
They just didn't put it in the game.
Okay.
So it is entirely possible that, like, these weird little points that we hear about may actually end up being significant later on, like they just haven't put that part in the game yet. So it is possible that, like, the Shadow of the Erdtree literally is the Helfen.
Okay.
But the Helfen may also never be mentioned again. It could be over.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sin.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. And see y'all next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Hi, Angel. What a good boy. Who's a good doggo?